Hi everyone, I'm Barrie Silver with Common Good Vermont, and welcome today to the first in our Work-Life Balance series. It's a webcast and it's called The Mindful Path to Workplace Productivity. And this is the first event in a series that we're doing to promote greater well-being and balance in the nonprofit workplace. I'm joined today in the Channel 17 studios in Burlington by productivity trainer Porter Knight. So welcome, Porter.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for being here. So this is a live show, and we have a number of individuals and organizations who are out there watching. So thank you for being here today. And if you have questions, you can call us, and that is at 802-862-3966, or you could email director@commongoodvt.org, and Morgan Webster will be happy to take your questions and comments. So, Porter, you were here last year, and when you were here, you focused on the individual and ways that we could get more done with less stress. And I want to remind people that you can find that webcast actually on our website, and it was the program was called Calm Within the Storm, Finding Your Inner Balance. And I think you said there were 5 tips for being more productive as an individual, more mindful.
Today we can talk a little bit about the individual and also some things that an organization can do from a policy approach.
Great.
So we'll augment some of what we discussed last year.
Excellent. Yeah, because we all know, those of us who work for nonprofit organizations, and there's a lot of us and a lot of you out there, nonprofit workplaces can be really hectic, stressful, filled with distractions, and we have a lot of demands. So how can we, as both individuals and organizations, sort of better manage all of that?
I guess the first thing is to remind ourselves that it's certainly not something that just those of us who do nonprofit work experience. So most people who work in the nonprofit world have had jobs outside of the nonprofit sector or have spouses or family members who do, and it's an epidemic of our culture. So it's certainly not just something that we suffer in the nonprofit world. I think that the culture of busy is something that everybody's wrestling with. And so when you invited me today and suggested the title of sort of the mindful path to workplace productivity, I thought that was a great way to talk about it, because I do teach workplace productivity and office organizing, and it's not always the case that people expect that in talking about getting more done, being more productive, that I'm going to come at it from this angle of a mindful practice. Mm-hmm. But I think that the mindful path is really an important part of that. So I thought we might want to talk a little bit about what mindfulness is and why that's relevant to us as individuals or organizations or in the workplace, and then talk about productivity and what that is, and what our hopes or dreams are in terms of being productive, and then talk about things that we can do, as I said, as individuals or as an organization or an agency.
Great. I think that sounds like a great thing, because obviously we're talking about productivity, then it's more than just making a list and checking off a million things to do and probably never getting to all of them. So how can we be more mindful and still be productive and effective in our workplaces?
Well, I think starting with a conversation about what productivity is important. And typically when people call me and they express frustration about getting organized, or they say I'm not as productive as I need to be, they're usually thinking about the list that gets longer at the end of the day instead of shorter, or that sort of sinking feeling that you have at the end of the day, where even though you scramble faster and faster and faster trying to get to the end of the day before you rush home and scramble more, that you haven't accomplished what you wanted to accomplish. And so that's sort of like, I'm never going to get to it, that feeling.
Right, and I think some of us have that at the beginning of the day, just feeling that sense of overwhelm.
Right, like if it's happened on a regular basis, then you end up feeling like you're starting the day and you're already behind.
Right.
And so, how do you make this a good, productive day? Mm-hmm. So I usually ask people to think about, well, what does it mean to be productive to you? Like, what are you talking about? And the first thing I want to do is normalize that as a professional organizer or as a productivity trainer, it's not my expectation that you're going to get everything done. Like, that's just not really what it's about. It's not about getting everything done.
Right.
It's about making choices about which things you're able to get done.
So, and what about, so making choices based on priority and prioritizing.
So I don't
what's
usually
most
use the language of
important?
prioritization. I think that prioritization is something that we do in a binary way. Like if I do this, then I'm not doing that. I've made a priority. So I don't need to sit and reflect on my prioritization, but if I identify that I am going to do this and I'm not going to do that, you've prioritized. So when I talk about sort of like defining the productivity and making choices, it doesn't have to be an exercise of prioritization. It's an exercise of literally saying, what am I going to do? And what informs that is partly what you're trying to achieve. So that might be, what it is that you're trying to create as an environment in your home, or what is it that you're trying to produce as outcomes at work. So, partly the goals that you're trying to accomplish drive the choice making. What am I going to do? And partly it's who you are. Like, who do I want to be? How do I want to be, on this earth? Who am I, and what's important to me? And so you can call either of those things goal setting or identifying your intentions or your values or beliefs. You can call that prioritization, but I don't think that, I think sometimes that language, like, well, I need to prioritize my tasks, it's just, that's another thing to do.
Right.
So rather than adding to your task of things to do, let's just look at what you're trying to accomplish and where you're coming from and who you want to be, and then let's make choices that are consistent or congruent, connecting your beliefs and your values to your outcomes and your goals.
So what if the choices that you're making aren't aligned with the expectations of your supervisor or the organization?
Well, interestingly, this is where the segue to the mindful path to productivity is so valuable, because the first thing about being mindful is just to notice. And so being mindful is a practice of noticing, and when you get in the habit or you're in the practice of noticing, then you notice things like, wow, it looks like the choices I'm making are out of sync with what's being required in the workplace. So then you ask your question, what do I have to do? And so what you need to do is probably have a conversation with your team or your supervisor and say, here's what I'm noticing. So it's not a judgment. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of a mindful practice, is it's observation without judgment. So paying attention to what's happening, as well as how you're feeling and what else is going on in the world. That noticing it's a mindful practice, and it's the first step to being more mindful in making choices that are going to bring you better into alignment with what you're trying to get done.
Great. I like the idea of doing more with less judgment, because I feel like we're struggling, as you said, this is a culture of busy, and we're all struggling with feeling like there's so much to do and never having enough time to do it all. And I know personally that I often throw that back at myself.
Exactly. And I think that that's one of the challenges of a culture of busy, is not only do we not accomplish what we set out to accomplish or what we felt we should accomplish, but then we beat ourselves up about it, and worse, we assume that everybody else is judging us in the same harsh way we're judging ourselves. When in fact, it's kind of like, what teenagers wear. Like, they're so worried about what other people think, but those people aren't noticing because they're worried about what they're wearing. So I don't think that people are as judgmental of others as we believe them to be. I think that we do that more to ourselves. And also part of the exercise of noticing without judging is to say, well, perhaps they are judging me. That's on them. So that you can still be who you are and make the choices you're making. And if you're being judged, that happened. So it's not something that affects you or impacts you. And so having that capacity to be aware and to separate your own experience from what you think is happening allows you to be more productive. And the neuroscience behind this is really, really clear. So what happens when we think we're being judged, or when we accuse ourselves of failing, anything that we do where that we're approaching that negativity, it moves the blood away from the thinking part of our brain and makes us less capable of performing in the moment and making the next decision. And so all of that judging actually makes us worse at our productivity. So being mindful gives us a chance to practice noticing without judgment, which allows us to make choices that are appropriate for us, and also lets us make better choices and do better work because we've got the blood in the right part of the brain in order to be effective. So it's a real win there. It's a real strong connection.
And a win, individually, and again,
organizationally,
branching that out.
Right, and familially as well. So if you're moving through the world in a way where you feel centered and competent, and like your choices are aligning with who you are and what you're trying to accomplish, that sets a tone for the people you love. That there's more acceptance and there's more possibility for people moving forward and making mistakes without being judged or condemned. And then saying, okay, I made a mistake. That action wasn't the one that is moving me in the direction I want to go. Now what? So the sun comes up every day. You have that chance every day to make new choices, to take new actions. So we're never just the sum total of all the things that happened before. We're always evolving and moving forward. That's the nature of life.
Right.
So.
The other thing that I wanted to touch upon, and hopefully this doesn't take us off on a tangent, but since we were talking about terms, so we're talking about productivity, but I also wanted to address the term work-life balance.
Yeah.
And whether, how you interpret that, and whether that is setting us up for unrealistic expectations, or I've heard, there's work-life balance. I've also heard the term work-life integration. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that, and then we can drill down into some more specifics about once we sort of have that awareness, then
now
what? Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think work-life balance is one of those phrases that's bandied about in a very unmindful way. So people are constantly lamenting that they don't have it, or that they should have it, or talking about skills that they need to build in order to achieve it, and not spending much time reflecting on, well, what do I mean? What is work-life balance? What is it that I really want? What is that goal that I'm trying to achieve?
So again, it's about establishing those goals and making choices.
Right. And so I think that the fact that it's a very common phrase is good to the extent that it invites people to pay attention to what's going on at work, what's going on at life, and how those things intersect, whatever that is, whether that's balance or integration or overflow or who knows. So the fact that we're talking about it is good. But I think that, like the phrase time management, once people sort of put it in a box, then it's easy to set it aside and say that's either something I have or I don't have. Poor me. Rather than saying, well, like, what do I really do about that? Like, what is time management? Well, time management is really making choices about what you're going to do with your time. You can't manage time. And I think that this idea of work-life balance makes it sound like, well, if I had work-life balance, everything would be fine. As if it was just this thing that you could take like a pill. Instead of recognizing that time management is making choices that takes your time and attention and energy, and it doesn't always go the way you planned. And work-life balance is a practice of identifying, where your boundaries are and what your intentions are, and then aligning your actions with that. And it doesn't always turn out the way you planned, which means that it's an ongoing thing. So I think it's not bad that we're talking about it a lot, but I would love to see people engaging with it more and personalizing it for themselves, so that I could say, well, for me, work-life balance means being home for dinner 4 out of 5 nights with my family. So I'm not making it right or wrong. Every night I must be or I've failed, but I'm saying this is my goal or my intention. And somebody else might say, well, for me, work-life balance means having the flexibility in my workday to coach my kids' soccer team. So I just want to encourage people to explore more what that means in terms of their goals and their personal intentions, so that they can put a plan into action to feel like, yes, I've achieved this thing I'm calling work-life balance, because I'm being mindful of the actions I take during the course of the day to produce a result that I've identified as positive for me.
Great. Well, I wanted to encourage folks to give us a call if you have questions about work-life balance and productivity in the workplace. And you can call 802-862-3966 or send an email to director@commongoodvt.org. We'd love to hear from you. And where do we go from here? So let's talk a little bit more about, I don't know, does all of this need to come from the top down in terms of, last year I know you talked about creating a caring culture, or cultures of caring, and that would be a workplace culture that encourages employees to take care of themselves and the people that they work with. And I'm just wondering whether that has to come from the top, or if it's...
I don't think so. I define culture as an amalgamation of our individual practices. So I think that any time that we blame the culture for something, the first thing we need to do is identify, well, what are our personal and individual practices, and then look for how we can change our practices to help move the culture in the direction that feels like it would be more healthy. So I don't think it has to come from the top down. I think it's great when an organization or a company does set priorities on this, but I think it can also happen with individuals. So I think as an individual, you have latitude to make your own choices, even if your organization or company is patently unsupportive or doesn't promote that and seems to have a culture of busy. And by making your own changes, you may impact that. But I think it's also possible for a company to say, hey, this is important to us, and to start to look at it at various levels. So yes, certainly from the top down, but from the middle levels or from the bottom up as well, as people start to have conversations here. So we can talk about, so what are those things that you can do as an individual, and what are those things that you can do as a company or an organization if you're in a role to do that.
Great, and we did get a question about what can managers do, and what policy changes can an organization make?
Okay, so let's start with that.
Okay.
So I think one of the things that a person in a leadership role can do in a company is have a conversation about a socially conscious mission. So when your mission statement is more holistic and it's broader than just producing the exact results that your company or your organization is set out to do, then that starts to create expectation of a culture where we're looking more at the whole person. So I think a socially conscious mission is one thing that people in a leadership position can do. And it doesn't have to be that their mission is perfect, that they're having the conversation already starts to set the tone. So that would be the number one thing that I would say, to a leader. If they're in a position to have conversations about policy direction, say to your peers at that leadership level, let's have this conversation. And then they can go lots of directions from there. So it may be that what they want to do is be having, brown bag lunches with employees, talking about what is a holistic culture for our company, or what would be a socially conscious element to our mission statement, or how do we need to adapt our mission statement to support our employees thriving in their own personal growth and development. But I think that when you look at it from a monetary standpoint, there's no question from the economics that employees who are connected to their work, so the buzzword is engagement, but engagement is, if not about having employees feel mindful and connected in the day-to-day choices that they have. Having employees feel that way means that they perform better and they're healthier. And this has to do with the neuroscience of decision making. So when people are in a setting where they have the opportunity to make choices, and they make choices that are aligned with the outcomes they're trying to achieve, they move blood to the thinking part of the brain, so they actually perform better at their work. But that process of moving blood to the part of the brain that helps you think well produces neurotransmitters that actually make us feel better. So as a result of being more thoughtful and performing better, we're also actually feeling more satisfied in our job, feeling more happy overall in our experience of the job. So that means that you get more work out of those employees, less absenteeism, greater longevity, and less healthcare ramifications. So and there's no secret about this. There's a lot of evidence that this is the case. So companies do well financially if they invest in their employees to support them in being mindfully engaged. So there's a lot of benefit there.
Yeah, and a lot of science behind it.
Yeah, and so it ends up being actually a pretty easy sell for the company to say, look, this is a triple win all around for everyone.
Yeah, because mindfulness, people can think of that as a term that doesn't fit the workplace. So it's fascinating to hear about it and to think about it in this context, and really...
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what a company can actually do in a mindfulness culture, because I think that the first thing everyone jumps to is do we need to have meditation rooms? And I'm all for that. I think that's great, but I think that that's sort of an instant assumption. But when I talk about mindfulness in the workplace, or what can a company do to actually enhance this beyond that sort of mission concept? I think about permission to focus. And what I mean by that is when a company creates an expectation that people have permission to focus on things, then stuff can shift. So examples of permission to focus would be to say, when we have a meeting, we don't bring our phones or any technology in. So we have permission to focus. They're saying, okay, team, when we meet together as a team, we want to be together as a team. We're not going to have our phones, and just having the phone there at all is instantly distraction. It doesn't matter if it's upside down on the desk, or it doesn't matter if it rings and you look at it and you go, oh, I'm not going to answer that, like you're doing everybody a big favor, right? Just don't even bring them in. So that the idea is that when we meet as a team, we're going to get as much done as quickly as we can. We're going to focus on what we're trying to do, and we're going to do it together in a relationship. And a lot of what's important in a workplace setting, and unless you work completely on your own in a silo of isolation, is that connectedness. And we lose that when we become less mindful of technology's pull. So when you get to a meeting and you're there a couple minutes early, what people typically do is they look at their phone.
Right.
So you might have 4 out of the 6 people in the meeting, but nobody's connecting, they're just looking at their phone. Instead, for that 90 seconds before the other 2 people get there, if you were saying like, hey, how's your dog? I heard your dog was getting old, whatever. And you talk about that. Now we have connection, and that creates the basis for trust, which creates the basis for interactions and quality performance and innovation. So that's an example of permission to focus. And there's lots of ways that a company can do that. It doesn't have to be an edict from the top saying, we want you all to focus.
Right.
It can just be these simple little things like no phones in the meeting, or saying as a company we have a company-wide quiet hour where we don't have meetings. Like this is the hour that we don't have meetings. So you take calls from outside people and you do your work, but in this one, you have this 1 hour where we don't interrupt each other and we don't have meetings. So we're saying we recognize that everybody has a lot of meetings, but we want to create an environment where you have permission to focus on things. So those are some examples of the permission to focus. I think that's another thing that it's very easy for a company to do if they think about what's actually happening. And if you ask the people within your organization, what is the experience you have? And they say, I'm crazy busy, I run from one meeting to the other and I never have time. Then you want to look at, okay, well, how can we change that?
And I think, so screens are definitely an issue. The other issue that I know we have here, and probably a lot of organizations have, is that there's no private space, that we're all working in these big open spaces. And those are challenging places to focus in.
Yeah, and more challenging for some people than others. I mean, some people can sort of get into something and it's easier for them. Once they're in, they do tune it out, and other people don't. So when I talk to people about organizing, like physical organizing, one of the tenets is ground rules for shared space. So, if we're organizing an office that we share, then we talk about, this is your space, this is my space, this is our space. And so you can have your style in your space, but in our shared space, you don't just sort of spill over. So we have ground rules for shared space. Where do things belong? How do they get put away? So that's a classic tenet of organizing. Shared spaces can have ground rules. So I think that we can do that same thing when we're talking about communication needs. So if everybody works in a giant fishbowl, then it's important as a team to have conversation about ground rules for shared space. What does that look like? And it might be that you say there's certain hours where we don't have conversations. It might be that we say you're encouraged or allowed to have headphones, noise silencing headphones, when other people are having conversations. It might be that you actually do an exercise where you practice what does it mean to use a quiet voice if you need to speak to a coworker within that shared space. Because typically what happens when you have sort of an open space or a fishbowl type environment is that people talk in their normal tones. And it's not that they mean to be disrespectful, it's normal, that's what you do. And so you can go through an exercise in your shared space where you lower your voice and lower your voice until you determine, like, what is the decibel that you can actually have a conversation with your peer and not be as voluble to others. And then you need to practice it, because what typically happens is people say, yes, we're going to use this quieter voice. And they start having their conversation, and then somebody else gets on the phone. So it ramps up a little bit, and it ramps up a little bit. And then by noon, we're all just loud again. And we need to have an opportunity to say, like, wait, quiet. And everybody goes, and we go back down and start over. And it's just practice. So shared rules for ground space can be, ground rules for shared space can be headphones. It can be, signage on your desk that says, I'm in my focus moment. Can you wait till 11? There's lots of options.
So when we're talking about policy and policy changes, are we actually talking about just having these shared expectations or ground rules, or are you really talking about having written policies that would be in the HR manual, for example, or all of the above?
Yeah, I think all of the above. And I think that there's not a one size fits all. So I think some organizations are going to say, really, we just need to have a conversation about this, and that's going to work. Other organizations, and I think partly it has to do with size, but if you have a larger organization where you're not just a small team talking to each other, then having it in writing is valuable, because it's a way for us all to say, yeah, this is what we're buying into and we commit to, and then also a way for you to bring new people in to that and say, this is part of our culture. This is what we expect. Whereas in a smaller team, it is done a little bit more organically. So I don't think that it's right or wrong to do it one way or the other way. I think some policies really are better written. And I think that those policies, so, email processing policies, I think are well to be written and rarely are. So email is something that sort of crept up, and now people, they just hamster wheel on email all the time, but they don't really have any real understanding of what the company's expectation is of them as it relates to being responsive through that particular communication medium. So they do it all the time, but they're not really doing it completely, and it's never done, and then they feel spread out. And that's probably the biggest complaint that I hear when people want to hire me is, I'm overwhelmed in email.
Well, the hamster wheel is such a great image. I mean,
right, because it just keeps on coming.
Okay, let's hamster wheel on to something else. Roll on to something else. And also, again, give us a call if you've got questions, 862-3966.
Do you want to segue and talk a little bit about some of the things an individual can do, even in the absence of a company saying we want to change our culture?
I think that makes sense, since we're all individuals, and we've got a variety of organizations, both large and small, that are participating today. So let's provide something for everybody.
So one of the things that I think is a missed opportunity is what I call seizing mindful moments. And so we were talking about email and how that causes a lot of stress for people. Another thing that I find causes a lot of stress for folks is, I call it the sort of the Microsoft wheel of meditation, right? So that buffering signal, and people see that buffering signal and they're trying to get something done, and then all of a sudden their computer goes into buffer, and people get so upset and angry because they're trying to rush, they're trying to get things done, and then they hit that wall. And I see that, I call it the Microsoft wheel of meditation, because I feel like that's one of those things that just happens. You can't control it. So that happened. So if you create that as a flag or a trigger to say, oh, look, I'm being invited now to just put myself back in my body and take a deep breath, and the wheel is going to either stop, or I'm going to need to shut down the computer and start over. But this is what's going to have to happen. So that experience of saying, again, it's that noticing without judgment. So instead of being instantly angry that you've been stopped in your technology progress, but saying, oh, when this happens, that's an opportunity for me to just get back in my skin and take a deep breath, and I can't control that. So I think that it's an important part of having a positive experience of your day, is taking those little triggers that make you crazy and turning it into something that can invite you back into your head and calm yourself down.
Well, it's interesting because we got a question about that really ties perfectly into this. What do you recommend? What do you recommend for organizations or individuals who feel weighed down by the news. There's so much news, and it's coming at us from all directions and from, multiple channels. And I think especially in the nonprofit sector as well, because we often are caregivers and caretakers of the world. And so it can feel very overwhelming and heavy. So finding those mindful moments and opportunities.
And I think the mindful moments, and then when you have the mindful moment, the purpose of the mindful moment is to put you back in your skin so that you can then identify, what can I do? And I think that's a really important part of that transition. So in order to feel productive, we want to take action. And taking action is a really valuable part of the mindfulness process. So you say, I'm here, and now what? So any opportunity you can have to put yourself back in your skin so that you can make that next choice is really valuable. And I think in the face of an onslaught of news or absence of resources or whatever the things are that are making people start to feel sort of frantic or panicked, to say, okay, here we are, now what? What can I do? Because there's always something that you can do. And bringing yourself back to focusing on your capacity to act is incredibly empowering. And the reason it feels so good is because of the neuroscience we talked about, where it moves the blood and the neurotransmitters it produces. But when we start to feel overwhelmed, we start to feel out of control, we start to feel a victim of circumstance, and to feel, I can never change that. And so that sort of abdication of your capacity to act, that victimhood, that's a complete opposite neuroscience. Blood's going away from the thinking part, and it's producing adrenaline and cortisol and making us physically ill, as well as demeaning our capacity to perform and act. So these mindfulness moments are really valuable. And I give the example of the Microsoft Wheel of Meditation, but other mindful moments that people might have during the course of their day is making a cup of coffee. So when you make your cup of coffee, say, every time I make my coffee or my tea, I'm going to be all in. And that's my mindful moment, like I'm making my tea. It doesn't take 10 minutes. It just takes a moment, but it gives you a moment to say, when I do this, then I allow myself to calm down and to connect.
I'm just looking, we got a couple more questions, and
Great.
I want to see if we have already addressed them. So we talked about the news and maintaining productivity in the age of alarming news. The role of leadership in achieving all of
Goals of mindfulness. So we talked about the idea of setting a socially conscious mission that might be inclusive of a holistic experience. We talked about permission to focus and doing some things specifically within the workplace, like technology-free meetings that you can do.
Or time to plan,
or
more time for planning.
Recognizing that getting organized is part of promoting productivity. And also in terms of permission to focus, leaders can model and articulate that they're not just frenetically rushing through their day, complaining constantly about how overwhelmed and busy they are, but they're actually scheduling time for themselves to be methodical and to move through the things they want to accomplish. The other thing that leadership can do is reward a mindful mindset. So if the people who are getting accolades and promotion are the ones who are running around like chickens with their head cut off, then what that suggests is that this company values frenetic activity as opposed to valuing methodical production. So I think it's really important for companies who want to encourage a more mindful experience to look at how they reward people. And that could be as simple as who gets accolades. It could be inviting people who are looking frenetic to take advantage of opportunities that the company may offer to learn new skills or to sort of soothe that style. But I think that celebrating the outcome, focusing on what people are accomplishing rather than focusing on their sort of level of busyness sets a tone for what's valued. So we want to accomplish these goals, and if you accomplish those goals, that's valuable, but just being busy isn't necessarily getting you where you want to be.
Right. I want to make sure that we cover everything we, we've covered a lot today.
She wants to
Let's
cover
make sure
everything.
I know everybody.
Right?
I want to cover everything, but we only have a certain amount of time. So I want to make sure that we've hit all the important stuff. And if we haven't, let's get to it now. And then I also want to let people know that remind people that this is the first webcast in our work-life balance series, and that we've got a couple more events that are happening. One that's happening later this month, and that is finding your balance, go with the flow. It's a actually free yoga class with Sangha Studio, which is a nonprofit yoga studio right here in Burlington's Old North End, and that's on January 25th, and it's a free class for nonprofit staff. And then on February 9th, we're doing another webcast with NFP, which is Steps to Organizational Wellness. And we'll be talking about NFP, about strategies, benefits, and programs nonprofits can implement to support wellness within the organization. So that's coming up next.
That's a great extension of this conversation, because we've talked about, from an organizational standpoint, what some things that leadership can do to change the culture or to set the tone. And then the next question is, what should we be doing? Like, what are the programming that we should be offering? And I think, as we talked at the beginning, that's the first place people sort of jump to. Like, do we need a meditation room? Should we be offering yoga classes? And I think yes to all of that. I think that's great. So I think that offering training in mindful practice and in productivity is very, very valuable. So offering the training is one thing, and that could look like helping people get organized, giving them the skills and supports that they need to manage their email, or to keep track of their to-dos, or to effectively schedule those things. It could be communications training. How do I communicate my reality to other people so that as a team we're all on the same page and nobody's expectations are missed? It can be the yoga classes, the meditation classes, exercise programs, all of which are integrally tied to people's capacity to perform and focus. But when we talk about these things, you go from sort of like idea, wouldn't that be great, to practice, yay, we have training, to sort of culture, like this is an integral part. And I think that's a transition that companies go through. So there's offering the training as sort of an ad hoc or an as requested, or it's like a wellness offering. And then there's having it be really, this is part of who we are. This is not just something that's offered one-off, but that's consistent, and that's it's a key part of our company. And for a small organization, that may not always be possible, but they can look for collaborations or possibilities so that can be part of a benefits package for people. So I think that those are what's coming next in your upcoming programs is a great extension of this conversation. But even if you work for a company that's never going to go there, or your association or agency feels like they simply don't have the resources, you can still take care of yourself as an individual. And so some of the things we talked about last time about, when I talked about the big three, like take care of your mind, get enough sleep, get regular exercise, eat in a wholesome way. Like those are such simple things. And I know with New Year's resolutions, people revisit them over and over, but it's worth saying. If what I really want is to be centered and productive, there's nothing else you can do that's bigger than getting enough sleep, getting regular exercise, and eating in a wholesome way. So the big three is what I call those. It's big three for brain care, and that's where I always start with people. And it's so simple. That doesn't mean it's easy, but in terms of mindful practice, if you say, I'm recognizing, I'm noticing that these are things that I'm not attending to, then the next natural question is, what can I do about that? And there's a lot of potential there, without judgment or condemnation, just to say, I notice this, what can I do?
Well, you make it sound so simple.
It is simple, even if it's not easy.
Right, okay, there you go, there's the difference. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about you. So you, as a productivity trainer, and the type of services that you could provide individuals and organizations beyond, today's webcast.
Sure. So I teach workplace productivity and office organizing, and I love speaking and training. That's actually one of the favorite things that I do, is standing in front of groups and talking to them about concepts that have to do with productivity and organization. So as I said, usually that's about email. It's about keeping a good list why use a list, what is the neuroscience behind an effective list, what makes a list a good list and not a good list, and then how do you transition from the list to the calendar? How do you actually not just have your intentions recorded, but actually get them done? So those are the biggest pieces that people often look for training around, and I love speaking and training to groups. But then I also do the one-on-one training, because sometimes people will come to a class or a workshop and they'll say, great ideas, and they'll go back and do it. And other times people will come to a class or workshop and they'll say, great ideas, and they'll go back to their office and say, oh, but where do I start? And so providing that one-on-one support where I can help an individual identify what their goals are and then streamline their physical space and create new habits to support them in accomplishing what they want to accomplish.
And people can find out more about you on your website, which
Sure.
is productivityvermont.com.
All spelled
All
out.
spelled out.
Yeah.
Great. So I think, we covered a lot today.
great.
We've got a lot of folks out there who have busy lives and busy schedules, and we really appreciate that you took the time to spend, some time with us today to be more mindful, and hopefully you'll also be more productive in your workplace. And we look forward to seeing you again later this month at Finding Your Balance, Go with the Flow yoga class at Sangha Studio. And then next month, Steps to Organizational Wellness with NFP webcast on February 9th. So thank you all for joining us. Porter, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I learned a lot.
Thanks.
And I'm going to go back and try to be a little bit more gentle with myself and notice and not judge.
Terrific.
So thanks again.
Thank you.